the policy. Well, there we go. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Beyond the Policy, the Human Side of HR webinar series. And we are so excited for our first session. And we're kicking it off with Maren Nelson and Ingrid Lindberg. And I'm going to let you guys share in a minute a little bit about yourself and 𝗂𝗵. But I am 𝗬tože😂'𝗋, the founder of Simon Says HR. And we work with HR leaders really to kind of meet them where they're at to ensure that they've got great, not just policies and procedures, which is also a little bit about what we'll talk about, but amazing, robust programs to support people within their workplaces to really be that employer of choice and providing those safe environments for people to work in. So what a better topic than our first topic. And so Maren and Ingrid, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll get going with our fireside chat webinar here. So Maren, how you go?
Well, thanks so much for having us, and thanks everyone for joining. Thrilled to be here. I'm Maren Nelson, co-founder and CEO of 𝗂𝗵. I'm also someone in long-term recovery. I celebrated 20 years of sustained recovery this year. And I'm the former co-founder of a group called 𝗂𝗹𝗺 at Salesforce. And out of that came the development of 𝗂𝗵 to try to help and solve for the need of substance use disorder in the workplace.
Nice. Thank you for joining us. Ingrid.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ingrid Lindberg. Dina, thank you so much for having us. And Hallie, thank you so much for making all this magic happen. I am the other co-founder of 𝗂𝗵, 25 years as an executive leader in health plans and all around the healthcare ecosystem. And I'm super excited to chat today about what is important when it comes to creating recovery-friendly workplaces. So Dina, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for being here. So I want to share, when we kind of talked about starting this webinar series, we did, say we just wanted to bring some really important topics to the forefront and do kind of like a fireside chat, but not use the word fireside chat. But there's no presentation today. It's really just us having a conversation. And so we have a couple questions that we've prepared just for the conversation that we'll ask, but we welcome questions from the audience because obviously you wanted to be a part of this for a reason and might have your own questions. So we want to make it super conversational. And again, we are recording it so that we can use this as we continue to have this important conversation. But I'd love to kick it off. And so here, Ingrid, I'm going to give you a question first. And so as a people leader, what do you think your role is in creating a recovery-friendly environment?
So Dina, that's like the $1,000 question, isn't it? Or the $1 million question, right? So it's interesting because I am not someone who is in recovery, but I am someone who has had lots of employees, right? I sat down and did the count a couple of months ago, and I'm somewhere between 24,500 and 25,000 people throughout my career that have been a part of my teams. And I will tell you, full disclosure, and why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, never once did I think about this. Never once did it cross my brain that one of my 10 employees was actively suffering with substance use disorder. Never once did it cross my mind that I might have someone on my team who was in recovery, who didn't want the bottle of wine that I was sending as a Christmas gift, or didn't want to attend the sales kickoff function that I was holding, right? Where we were drinking heavily and passing around champagne and, mimosas at breakfast. And I worked for some really big companies. And this was really pervasive at American Express, at United, at Cigna, at Prime Therapeutics. There was a lot of liquor involved in celebrations and gatherings and pretty much everything that we did, right? And what's been fascinating in the 2 years that Maren and I have been working on 𝗂𝗵 is really starting to suss out, where are those roles, right? What is HR's role? What is my role as an executive leader? And what I've learned over this last 2 years is it really would have been, or was, as irrelevant and irreverent as just ignoring someone who had a broken arm and couldn't go pitch baseball with us. It would be just as bad as someone who was allergic to the sun and asking them to go outside, right? I mean, and we really didn't spend and haven't spent enough time thinking about that. And so when we talk about recovery-friendly workplaces, right, it really is about just creating safe spaces for all of your employees. And we've done such a good job in so many different companies across so many different diseases, but this one we have not. So I think it's really important that leaders are paying attention to this, and even more that HR people are. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to ask you some questions about what you think HR should be doing.
Love it. And I love what you just said too. Even the like like you said, people in the workplace that come with a broken arm, right? Like how do we make accommodations? Like it's just that we do all these things for things that maybe are visible and that we know about. But yes, how to create the safe spaces so that somebody who's going through these situations, it is visible and they feel that they can come to you as a leader. Yeah, thank you for that. I love that. And yeah, you've managed a lot of people in that time.
but completely failed at this, right? So it's a mission we are on now to make sure that we're helping people not be invisible.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so Maren, are you ready for a question?
Of
Okay.
course.
So what was it like being someone in recovery and having to tell your boss about it?
Yeah, depends on the boss.
Right?
Really depends on the boss and what are the vibes and how much is that boss talking about drinking as part of their life and heavy drinking as part of their life and their weekend and the team activity we're about to go do. So, I've been sober a long time. I got sober when I was 24, and in part because I have a dad in long-term recovery, who tonight I get to give his medallion for 38 years, which is wild. So I grew up seeing that there is a path out. And so that saved me from what could have been a lot longer of drinking. And so getting sober as young as I was, that means I was early in my career. And I was really lucky that when I first got sober, at the time I worked in nonprofit healthcare and I had a really supportive boss. And we were also talking about very stigmatized disease conditions in this work. We were supporting people who worked with HIV and AIDS populations. And so inherent to that work meant I was in a safer community of employees and of leaders. And so I'm really grateful that that's where I was when I got sober, and I felt safe in saying, I have to leave work at 5 o'clock every day because I have to make my meeting. And she was super supportive and totally got it. Fast forward, at some tech companies I was at, and I had some bosses who really liked to drink, and some bosses who really liked to drink. And were really uncomfortable with me not drinking and would challenge me on it and say, well, how bad was it? What happened? Did you get a DUI? Did you tell me the goriness of it? And that's more common than you think. That story of why aren't you drinking is actually pretty common. And sometimes it comes from customers. And that was the most awkward, actually, more than a boss. A boss, I felt more comfortable being like, no, I'm sober. I don't drink. And some of that's inherent to who I am and my personality, and just I am who I am. And it's actually helped to keep me sober in lots of very heavy drinking cultures where I've seen others relapse or return to use. But when I had a customer once put a shot in my face and say, you want this deal done? Join us. Why aren't you joining us? And, I just was I got to get out of here, and I had a supportive boss. And so I left. But I think about that employee who does not feel safe in disclosing, who does not want to disclose, who does not feel like they have permission to leave that situation. And I see it in my community of recovery that people do return to use while traveling for work, at a conference for work, entertaining a customer, because there is often an unspoken expectation that you're participating. And then from people who are concerned maybe about their own use, it can feel really threatening to be around someone who's not drinking. And then power dynamics, right? Of who's in leadership or who's the customer. And so again, if we can bring that awareness, if we can normalize people choosing not to for whatever reason, if we can stop asking, why aren't you, right? In a way that feels unsafe. I just think we can set up a situation where people have a better chance at staying sober if that's their goal.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I didn't even think about that from a customer perspective, right? Like it's one thing if it is within your own people, your boss and your boss's boss or coworkers. But to be in that type of a position with a customer, and thank God you did work for somebody that you felt comfortable in saying no to this customer and you didn't care about getting the deal done. But I never even thought about that as that as an opportunity to have happened. So I'm sad that that happened for you, but I love again that we're having this conversation, just because it does probably happen way more than we think. And so how as HR leaders and people leaders we can support our people, which is why we're having this conversation. So really quickly, I know we're gonna just keep talking, but one of the things I'd love for you to share is, can you talk about what you did do at Salesforce? Will you share a little bit about that background? I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So back in 2020, COVID, as you remember, was happening with no vaccines yet. And people were isolated and stressed out. And that's a perfect environment for returning to use. And so I was watching a lot of people in my recovery community struggle. I watched some friends die. It was a really tough time. And we now have all the data that says people accelerated their drinking, 30% increase for people who drank, reported drinking 30% more. We've started seeing data around people who are working from home and how much they're drinking and using substances. And so it continues. It's not like COVID ended in, right? So it's 2020. This is what's going on. That's the framework. And I connected with some sober sales leaders. I was a sales leader in the enterprise space for Salesforce and connected with another who had posted on LinkedIn about being sober. We had a great chat. And after a couple of these great chats, we're like, gosh, we should really start this for other people. Because if this feels so good for me and I'm 15 years sober, and I'm feeling really awkward about turning down that virtual wine tasting I just got invited to, because again, there's an expectation I'm going to be entertaining our customers remotely with that glass of wine. And that's not a safe thing for me to do. And so I would have to out myself. And again, I'm 15 years sober. I'm in a position of power. It feels safer for all those reasons to say no, but it still feels weird to be like, I can't be at that thing. Not because I'm going anywhere because we're in lockdown, but because I'm not going to have wine in my house and I'm not going to pretend I'm drinking it. And so we said, we got to do something. We got to reach the person who's newer in their recovery journey, is newer in their job here, and feels like this is a requirement, to say, no, it's not a requirement. You can opt out and it is okay to be sober. And if you need help, we're here. And so we created a group called Soberforce. And it was for any employee at Salesforce who was sober, sober curious, or sober ally. And we intentionally said sober ally. And I think this is a really important point to call out, is that we can't rely just on people in the recovery community to carry this message. We need allies, just like everything else. We need allies who will come to learn. We'd have leaders come in and say, I'm just not creative. I can't think of anything to do other than a virtual wine tasting. We'd be like, how about an art class? How about a cooking class? How about a coffee tasting? They're like, oh, great, amazing. I don't have to do wine tasting. So, it was serving all these purposes. And what we learned was that we had a lot of family members who were interested and were struggling with, how do I talk to my college student I'm worried about? How do I talk to my sibling who I'm worried about? Just as much as people who are in recovery and had never felt like they could share it at work, but were so excited to have a community to be of service to another colleague. We had people returning from treatment who were like, oh my gosh, I just searched sober. I'm so happy you're here. Like, I was so freaked out coming back to work. And like, now there's a group of people. So within 5 months, we had 500 employees join. And it still is going so strong today. They're close to 1,000 members. It has continued to grow, and it continues to destigmatize recovery and destigmatize addiction and substance use disorder and normalize recovery. However, we were missing, where do we point someone who needs help? So when someone would call me, because I was the president in the face of Soberforce, and they would say, where do I send my kid for help? I was not qualified to answer that question. And I did not feel like I could be helpful. And that is where the idea of Sober started to percolate, because it was like, as we dug in, I couldn't believe that we didn't have a better benefit solution to solve for tangible care navigation needs in this space.
Nice. And so in like an EAP is kind of where you're headed, right? And so looking at then an HR department and all the things that they can have. So Ingrid, I'm going to ask you, so this kind of goes back to again the work that you both have done together. But what are those conversations then with executives on how to navigate and how to have these resources? And if you want to talk a little bit about Soberanth and what you're creating, that this would be a good time as well.
For sure. And I'm going to warn you now, Dina, I've got a question for you at the end of this, because one of the things that I've just been dying to ask you is, why do you think HR hasn't been tackling this? And you're an HR pro. You've been in this space for a really long time. You know everybody in this space. So I will totally answer as long as you promise to talk about that when I'm done. Is that a deal?
Oops, Ingrid, I think we
We've
just,
started with what we do with Soberanth is we go in and we help organizations really change how they operate. So we come in, we spend 90 days with an executive team. We work through, how do you actually celebrate? How do you talk about this? What do you do? Are you paying attention to this? We introduce a new benefit, and we spend a lot of time with the executive team and then with human resources, helping them to learn how to talk to managers about this, how to talk to team members about this. We offer trainings, what to look for, how do you approach someone, right? So we really go through that entire process of helping an organization feel ready and be ready to have these types of conversations. And we do all of that in concert with the HR leaders and an executive sponsor. So we have learned that one of the most important things that we have to do is we have an executive sponsor at each of our customers who stands up in the beginning of this process and says, hey, guess what? Here's my story. Here's my story. And one of the things that we've learned, and because Maren and I both had lots of jobs in lots of different companies, I worked for 𝗬𝗂𝗧 at Cigna for a long time. And one of the most profound moments that we had at Cigna when we were really trying to change the culture of Cigna, David was a new CEO, the old CEO had left, the prior culture had been very punitive, very rigorous. You couldn't make a mistake, it wasn't allowed. And Cordani got up one day at an all-employee meeting and he told a story about how he had made a really major mistake the week before. And it silenced, 42,000 employees, right? Silenced them because it was that first time where someone had actually stopped and said, it's okay to make a mistake. You're not going to be fired if you make a mistake. And here I am talking about the mistake that I made. So we used that, right? That learning, that methodology, and applied that to how do you make a place safe for an employee? Well, you've got to start with an executive leader standing up and saying, here's my personal story. I'm going to share it because we're not going to be an organization where this is something that I should hide. This is a part of me, right? We talk all the time about bring your whole self to work and be a whole person. And this isn't about you're bad if you do. This is about there's a lot of people who don't, and we need to make it really safe and open for them. So that's some of the stuff that we do as we come in and work with companies. And then we turn on the benefit after that. And the benefit is a 24/7 concierge service, right? We answer the phone using peer coaches 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Because as we like to say, stuff doesn't happen Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. It really happens in times when you have a moment to breathe. And sometimes that's 3 o'clock in the morning. And so those coaches that we've got can help people find help. We can be supportive if that's what we need, right? We can do all of these things to help people and their family members go through something that's really hard, that HR doesn't know how to navigate, that leaders definitely don't know how to navigate. And frankly, what we've learned is EAP doesn't know how to, and insurance doesn't know how to. So that's what we're after. Now, I'm going to say this to you, Dina, because it's fascinating because we sit down with, lots and lots of companies who are very excited about hearing about this and really are interested in talking to us about this. And, one of the questions that we lead with is, have you ever had to take that call from your employee? Have you ever had to take that call from your employee, right? Where you didn't know how to help them, you didn't know where to send them, you didn't know how to do the research, you didn't know what was best for them because you're not trained in this.
Mm.
And so I'll punch back to you and say, as you think about that question, you think about what we're talking about, why do you think HR hasn't been talking about this yet until today?
Right. Yes. Well, and I'll take that. So, I mean, I think it kind of goes back also to what Marin said about like she had bosses that love to drink and bosses that love to drink. So I think it really does start from the top. So as you talked about, Ingrid, like this conversation on standing up there as an executive and saying it's okay to make mistakes. And so I think it comes from that, from an HR leader being courageous enough that says, hey, not just even this topic, but so many other topics. Like we need to be looking at what is happening within our employee base. Because as you said, the things that happen within our employees' lives doesn't happen between 8 and 5. There's less happening between 8 and 5 because they're at work normally, if that's a normal, yes, work time. So it is the things that are happening outside. And even if it's not physically for them, it's what's happening within their families and their extended families. And there's just so much, right? So I think why HR might not be doing it is maybe just certain HR departments or individuals feeling that they don't have the position power to maybe influence change or open up that conversation. And then if they do, where the conversation is met at, right? And so if it's met with openness and an opportunity, and just like anything else, I'm sure as you guys are going in and talking, there still is a line item because it's still something that they have to invest in. And so then it's also, how do we track back these benefits and why would you not? Because of the expense of not supporting these individuals, the turnover, the things that can happen, and all of that. So it's really tying back that ROI on these amazing opportunities to have. The other thing I would just share that happened actually this week is I have a dear friend that was terminated from a very large global institution. And so contacted me saying, hey, will you walk me through this? I'm shocked that I was just terminated. So I want you to look at my severance, all this kind of stuff, and give me advice as to should I, get a lawyer? Should I fight this? And so I laughed and said, well, normally I'm on the other side of it, so I'd be happy to help you. And so working with her, and one of the things that we found out is she wanted to use an EAP for some things that were going on actually with her boss. So she's somebody who probably left the organization just because her relationship with her new leader within the company. And we talked about that because they, just in our conversation overall, and she's like, they had an EAP, but I was also afraid to use it because I didn't know in this big global organization who might know if I used it. So I think that's another piece back to confidentiality and safe place. And so people that, are potentially wanting to go through recovery, returning from recovery, like trust in whatever systems are in place, and that HR and leaders also aren't having, they're not watching that in that way, but that they want to see that there's utilization in a good way and that we're providing these benefits. So I think that's a cultural piece too that could be a factor in that. So I'll put Ingrid or Marin, anything on that you just from a feedback, and then we can go to a next question.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head, right? What we hear time and time again, which I love, is I don't trust it. I don't trust it. I don't trust my insurance company. I don't trust my employer. I don't trust my EAP. They're all tied together. I don't trust. And one of the things that we've done that we're very purposeful about is every piece of communication, everything that we do, everything talks about free and confidential to the employee. And so much so that when you come in and you log into our platform, you don't need a member ID, you don't need an employee ID, you don't need to use your work email. We've done everything that we can to remove that fear for people. And I'm sure it still exists, right? I mean, we're something that's being introduced from an employer to an employee population. However, everywhere that we have the opportunity to say, we don't report anything back, it is truly confidential. You can choose to trust us. You don't even have to give us your real name when you call us or when you log in. And we think that's actually one of the main drivers as to why this is working, is that it is confidential and it is anonymous. And people, I mean, some of the names are funny, right? Some of the names are funny, but hey, if that makes you feel better to be Anna Banana today, then you can be Anna Banana and we will call you that. And that's the only traceability we have for you. So you hit the nail on the head. Nail on the head, Tina.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Thank you for that. So Maren, I have a question for you. So as somebody that is going through recovery, what could a leader do to make that process easier?
I love that. Yes, I think being thoughtful about how do we get our teams together. So if there are after hour get-togethers, can we do something that's not at a bar? Can we go volunteer together? Can we go do something outdoors together? I also think the power of bonding for everyone, regardless if you have substance use disorder or not, is probably more sustainable and powerful when it's not centered around drinks at a bar. I think there's a lot to be said for getting a team outdoors, if everyone's able, or go giving back into the world somewhere go walk dogs or play with dogs at a shelter. Or, there's so much we can do together. So I think being mindful of how do we gather, how do we celebrate, how do we reward? It kind of cracks me up because if you don't laugh, you cry. That the reward for top sellers like President's Club is basically to go on a booze-filled trip somewhere warm. And I can't tell you the number of sober sellers. We had a cheeky expression going for a long time of sober sellers sell better, because the number of people I know who are in President's Club who are sober is statistically a very high number. And there's always a trend line of before I got sober, I never hit President's Club. And after I got sober, I hit it every single year because it turns out we're really productive. And the data all shows that sober employees are actually your most retained, your most productive, your least expensive when it comes to healthcare. Like, we are actually people you want, and there's 21 million of us in the US. So I think the mindfulness of who's on your team, without having to ask anyone to disclose, how do we make it inclusive? Express full permission to skip things that make you uncomfortable for whatever reason, because maybe someone's neurodivergent and being in a loud bar is not going to work for them, right? So like, there's lots of reasons why someone might not feel comfortable showing up at the thing, and give people permission to opt out for their own well-being. And then I think the piece, of course, if they're partnered with Sobrinth, like a lot of what we do, and Ingrid touched on this, is reminding leaders that they don't need to play the role of therapist, coach, navigator. They're not qualified to be that. They should not feel like they have to be that, but they do have a responsibility to tell their team members that we're here and to remind them of what benefits do exist.
I love that. So as you just talk about that, so that's even going back to the question on, like, from an HR perspective that Ingrid asked me, if I'm sitting in an HR or a leader position and I've never been through having myself go through recovery or a family member go through recovery, I might feel that I'm not capable. And again, it is just remembering that I don't need to be the one that is capable. My job is really just to find the tools and resources and present them to my employees, people that I care deeply about, and find that path for them. So love that. And it really fascinating on the whole sales and President's Club. Really fascinating. It would be a really interesting, and if you have the data, it would be very interesting to look at, because what you just said too, like, so it is the big sales trips and all inclusive, whatever. There's lots of drinking that happens. The other piece you mentioned is, yes, the drinking can lead to other health issues, which then leads to healthcare increase. So there's a cost there. And so that is super interesting, that that piece of the data point. Love that. And when we were prepping with us just to talk about this today, I mean, I come from very high sales organizations where absolutely there were those president clubs and trips and all of that, and lots of drinking that was happening. And I had shared, maybe 30, well, it wasn't 30 years ago, but at least 20 years ago now, I had a senior leader who was brand new to the company and showed up at our big, national celebration. And definitely lots of drinking was happening. And this person did something when very intoxicated that they should not have done. And the next day, I, as a leader, had to get the head of HR with me, and we had to let this person go. And it was super hard, but we had to do it based on like what had happened. And then about 15 years later, I was able to reconnect with this individual, and he had shared with me, he said, I just want to talk to you about what happened all those years ago and let you know that that was the last time that I ever took a drink. And had shared like however I had handled the situation and our HR person had handled the situation, like they felt we had done a good job, because they felt, you know, it was unfortunate that they had to hop on an airplane and head back. But the way that we handled it, and I was like, oh, thank God we handled it well, because I don't really remember, you know, 15 years ago, the exact conversation. But so proud of this individual then for, you know, getting the help that he needed and do what he needed to do. And so just sharing this conversation back. And then as we talked about it 15 years later, it's like, well, oh my gosh, here we have you in an environment. So everything you just talked about, here we have you in an environment where we weren't putting the drink necessarily in your hand, but we certainly had it in front of you. Like it was the environment, and that was something that people get caught up in, right? And you don't even realize. And so, yes, so companies do need to start looking at those types of Christmas parties, the happy hours, the get-togethers, and start looking at it through a different lens. So Maren, I'm going to ask you one more question on that. So with that kind of conversation, there is a new push towards making sure there's non-alcoholic stuff at events and things. And that's been a really lovely thing that I have seen and witnessed really heavily over the last couple of years. So that's kind of a movement. So love your thoughts on that.
Well, it's so exciting because when I got sober 20 years ago, it was like Diet Coke or sparkling water. Those were your choices. So I just had a lovely dinner out last night with my husband and some friends, and they had their mocktail menu was almost as long as their cocktail menu. And it was really good. It wasn't juice. It wasn't just plain juice. Like it was an actual lemonade. It was an actual thoughtful and delivered in a beautiful glass with garnishes. And like the inclusive nature of a mocktail menu is really powerful, because so much of drinking, I think, is about wanting to feel connected and bonded and relaxed, right? And yes, alcohol is playing a role in that, but also it's more the doing something together in community, right? And so before, when I couldn't have that fancy drink or that champagne toast, I felt left out. And I'd have to run through, okay, Martin, you know, it was never cute. It was never a cute glass of wine. It was like disgusting box wine, you know, like you have to remind yourself when you're in long-term sobriety, like what it's really like. And that, you know, it's never sophisticated for me. But having an NA option is so great. And there was this moment that I talk about, and I'll continue to talk about because it was really powerful at Salesforce, where it was company kickoff. We are 2 years into Sober Force at this point, and we've been working also with the events and marketing team to think about how to be more inclusive in our events. And I didn't know that they had this planned, but we show up for the kickoff toast that happens on opening night. And for the first time, I got to toast with my colleagues with the same champagne glass, but an NA sparkly, not, you know, NA champagne, whatever, sparkly juice. And it felt so profound to stand there and toast everyone for the first time in a very long sales career without having to use a plastic bottle of water. Right? Where you just feel like, can I have a giant sign on my head that says, I'm not drinking, I'm not doing this thing that you're all doing the celebratory way. But I got to be part of that emotion of the celebration. And here's the thing, it's not just people in recovery. There are a lot of people who do not care to drink at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. They would rather not. And so giving them that choice. So the story you said, Dina, and I appreciate that about this person that went through this, and it sounds like it had a great outcome. But I know people who had terrible outcomes, and it led back to use, and it led to their death, of situations that happen at work where they're at the celebratory thing and they feel like, well, why not? You know, and so again, it's not an expectation that companies are there to keep people sober, but providing that choice to make it a little less hard, right? To not have it be so centered around alcohol. And we do support, for the record, all substances. We just talk a lot about alcohol because alcohol is the one we still continue to go to. right? We can collectively demonize opioids as a society, and that's an easy one to get behind, an easy talk track to get behind. It's a lot harder with alcohol, to be in the nuance of it. So yeah, I think that NA movement is really powerful and in a good first step in normalizing choosing not to.
Nice. I love that. Yeah, I think it has been, so that's awesome. And it's been such a welcome. I mean, you're right. Even yes, like not everybody wants to drink at noon or at 3 p.m. So I've been to networking events absolutely that start at 3 and people are starting to drink. And it's like, if I know I'm also going to be driving home, I sure would love to be able to have an NA option. So we actually haven't talked about this, but so I was at an event in December. That was one that always now has an NA option, and I opted for an NA option. And when I left that event, it was 5:30 on a Thursday evening, and here in Minnesota, and it wasn't even because we had bad weather. It was just super cold, but it wasn't like icy. It was just stop and go traffic. I actually was rear-ended, and my car was totaled and had a concussion. And I actually remember even that day saying, thank God I left that evening and I had not had a drop of alcohol, right? So thank God that there were really cool options for me also to have that day. So absolutely. Um, so Ingrid, do you have another fun question for me?
I do. I have, can I rotate for 1 second, Dina? And then I'm totally going to ask you about a question that we get from HR leaders. So I would love your opinion on it. I think one of the most fascinating things about this, and we repeatedly say, right? I mean, we're not trying to take alcohol away, right? It's really about how can you offer different solutions. I always laugh when we talk about, can we go for a dog walk? I couldn't do that because I'm highly allergic to dogs, like 20% of Americans, right? So it's really about extending your inclusivity thought process as a leader. And just a few things that are not newer, but just fascinating data points, because I think we also are really good at saying it's them, right? So we've got real stats. 1 in 10 employees have SUD that are full-time employees, 1 in 12 part-time employees. We know that 1 in 5 employees who are working remotely have reported drinking while working, 20%. We know that 35%, in addition to the 40 or 48.5 million that currently have substance use disorder in our country, we know that another 35% are just sub-threshold to that diagnosis. So this number is just growing, right? It's just growing. And I don't know if any of you guys have ever followed or read anything that 𝗤_𝗏 does. She's a health economist. I've had the privilege of knowing her and working with her for 20 years since the Definity Health days, Dina. And she's been doing some work digging into women in the workplace and what's going on with women in the workplace. And, you know, there's these 6 derailers, 5 of them are financial. I mean, it's just, you know, women are taking on a lot. And we were dialoguing, and I dug up this piece of information that was just, I mean, it just stops you, right? So there's a study that came out in 2023 from RTI International that found that women with children under age 5 seem to be the most vulnerable to excessive drinking, with rates that increased 323% during the pandemic. 5 years after the start of the pandemic, alcohol use remains almost as high for that group. So it's really easy to be like them, her, it, not, and that's all fine. But the reality is, you know, as leaders, you really do have to look around, and as HR leaders, this is something that is incredibly pervasive, and more so than someone sitting there with a cigarette at their desk, right? And we nipped that in the butt real quick. I mean, it took us like a good 100 years to do it, but we did. When we finally figured that out, we nipped that in the butt. So just some, you know, I like to use the stats because opinions are great, but completely irrelevant. So you go back to the statistics, it's like, yeah, okay. So question for you, my friend, is one of the things that we introduce into these organizations, employee resource group, affinity group, we don't care what you call it, a pizza party, it doesn't matter, right? But a place where people who are sober curious, who have friends or family who are struggling with substance use disorder, right? I mean, you just think about 2 in 3 families in America are suffering with this, right? There's a huge need for a support system. So we love introducing that just like you have a women in technology or a Bible study group or I mean, there's thousands of these. There's thousands of these ERGs. And it's really curious because we're seeing that some employers are like, yep, that totally slots in with every other ERG we have. And then some who are like, oh, we don't think we can bring that. We don't think we can do that. That might not be the right move for us. So I'd love your thoughts around, standing up something that's a sober, curious, sober supportive, right? All of these words, but a place for people to just go talk about this where it's safe. How do you feel about that as an HR leader, having that as a tool in your toolkit?
So I love it. And what I love is, again, if you can find like a couple people to help spearhead it, right? That might have they don't have to be huge executive stakeholders, but some people that want to be involved from the beginning and can get people rallied around it. I think it's amazing. I also have to share, I mean, I have a 22-year-old daughter who just graduated from college, who's in her first professional career. And she's not one that's gonna just, go hang out at the bars either. And so she would certainly go, but she's gonna choose water because she's also not gonna feel comfortable maybe drinking around her new colleagues, right? And so I also think there's another generation that's coming out into the work world that is expecting something different. They've seen, so kind of like us growing up, and we did have parents that, had liquid lunches at noon. And so our kids have seen maybe a difference. We're not having liquid lunches, but we sure did go out for happy hours, on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and possibly on Fridays. And so I think there's a new generation coming into the workforce. So I think the HR professionals that can get behind how to have these really cool, clubs that can start having these conversations, bringing in speakers, creating that wealth of knowledge for people to have a safe environment, I think is a differentiator actually, and a huge benefit for a next generation coming in. I love that.
We're going to bring you with us everywhere, Dina. We're going to be like, and here's the HR lady who knows everything about HR who's going to talk about this. It is fascinating, though. I mean, it's really fascinating. I remember years ago, I was trying to create literally just like a women's ERG. And I will not name the company, but the leadership was too afraid to gather all the women together to have a women's ERG. And I feel like that's kind of what we're seeing with some, not all, right? But with some people here, it's like, oh, we're a little afraid. So we got to figure out how to get over that hump with people. But we're working on it one by one, right?
Yeah, I love that. But even that, like they're afraid to have a women's ERG group because then where's the men's group, right? Like, so the inclusivity there. So
Mm-hmm.
that's, how do we have lots of different
Lots
groups,
of groups, lots of groups.
right?
We can have an allergy group. We can have a scent-free group. We can have a, sober group. We can do everything. We can let people find each other.
Exactly. Well, and you talked about like being allergic to dogs. So there was that like bring your pet to work kind of situation. Well, not everybody wanted their pets next to, they couldn't handle that.
Ruins me, sends me into the hospital.
So Marian, let's bring you back. And what else would you like to share on how leaders can just be most supportive? So if you're a young leader and this is the first time that somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm headed to recovery," or even if I have a family member that is headed to recovery, what from your vantage point as an employee who's gone through it, and I love that today is also a very big milestone for your father. But from your seat, what would you say to a leader on how to best, support somebody?
Well, hopefully they're partnered with Sobrent so they can say, we have a resource for you. Because without it, it is really tough because you're left going, here, let's try to cobble together with what we have where I can point you. But I think the first is compassion and empathy and listening and really leaving space for that person to tell you what they want to tell you. And it's been interesting in the trainings we do because leaders will ask us very tangible, like, I had this situation, I said this thing, I don't know that it was the right thing, I kind of question it, how could I have handled that better? And one of the comments someone made to me was, I told them, oh, you're not a junkie. Someone had to self-describe themselves as a junkie. And that was the term that the employee had used about themselves. And so we talked about the difference of terms people use for themselves versus terms that others can use about them. And there's a difference. Someone can call themselves whatever they want, but it's not your job to say, oh no, you're not an alcoholic. Oh no, you weren't that drunk at that event. Like if someone's expressing to you that they're concerned about their use and using whatever term they're using, I think the most important part is just to receive it, to say, how can I support you? To affirm to them that they are safe to get help in the company. There are protections within Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to get into what they are, but there are protections around when you express the need for help, you know, how much help you can get, that you're protected and your job is protected. And so I think that leader being able to be that conduit with HR, if that's something the employee is looking for, to better understand what kind of disability leave options do you have, what other support do you need, right? And so when you had said earlier about EAPs and why people may not be using them, I mean, what we hear time and again, especially when I just talk about what I do for a living, a lot of my friends will say things like, what's an EAP? And they work at big companies where I'm like, guarantee you have an EAP. So no one knows what it is. Let's just start there. And then what happens when you call for substance use disorder? So this is where the leader is probably going to point someone without a sober. They'll say, let's call the EAP. Usually what happens is that EAP points you back to your insurance. You can imagine how that conversation goes. Or they will say, you have these treatment centers that are covered by your insurance. Here's the thing. 6% of people with substance use disorder sought treatment in the past year. A whole bunch of us get sober without treatment. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for treatment. There totally is. I have dear friends who only got sober because they went to inpatient treatment. But there's a bunch of people like me who got sober through 12-step meetings or other sober programs. And so if our assumption and our benefits in the workplace that leaders are left to point people to are so narrow in scope, then when they call that solution that you have for them, and that solution has got one tiny fraction of a support pathway, including the health insurance companies also don't have a resource directory. Theirs is also really limited. So, and they'll say things like, well, you pick what treatment you want to go to, and then we'll tell you later if it's covered. Can you imagine if you had cancer and they're like, start chemo and we'll kind of figure out if we're covering it or not once you're in? It's just wild. So to your question, your original question, what do leaders do? I think it's compassion, it's empathy, it's listening, it's helping connect to the resources you know exist, but it's also an acknowledgement that those resources might fall short. And what we'd really love to see and what we continue to see with our customers is that the way we set up these relationships oftentimes is because a sober employee or an ally, a family member of, hears about what we're doing and says, my company needs to have this, and walks us through the doorway with HR and says, this is my lived experience. And it would have been so much easier if I would have had Sobran. And so our broader ask, I think, to the community is for an opportunity at that conversation, because we still have so much lack of awareness that this is a recoverable disease, that very few people are getting access to treatment today, whatever that treatment is, and that we have to do better. It's just, we should not be abandoning so many people to try to figure this out on their own.
Right. We have to do better. Everything that you just said. So I agree. And just also to kind of put some bows around this. So I agree we have to do better. I agree a lot of people don't know what an EAP, an employee assistance program, is. They don't know what that is, where to find it, which is sad in itself because employers pay a lot of money to have these programs that nobody's using. So then that's again a look at the ROI. If nobody's using it, then why don't you look at doing other things then and create these resource groups and bring in a different conversation, because there could be a line item to use that as an example. But when you were talking about that, so here's your insurance and here's potentially like a treatment facility, that I was just thinking the same thing. That is like somebody having a potential cancer diagnosis and saying you must go to this, oncologist. Well, no, there's lots of different options depending on what kind of cancer I have and what I choose to do. And yes, so it is, having just those resources. And then the important thing, and I totally totally agree with you, is from HR, from a leadership perspective, just that compassion. So to be available, to be there. And that is, again, why we really wanted to open up this conversation, because it is the human side of HR and also just people leaders. And in today's world, it's hard because we have employees that are dealing with so many things, and not that we haven't, 30 years ago had employees that were dealing with things. But I think there is so much more going on right now. It was interesting, some of the statistics as well, like COVID. There's two things that still sold in COVID, and surprisingly, lipstick, because we were all masked up, but because we were on Zoom, so lipstick still sold. And then alcohol, yeah, like we couldn't keep it on the shelves because people were home drinking, and we didn't come out of COVID that long ago. So there is still, those situations. So Kristen and I on the Simon Says HR side, I mean, we're working on a daily basis. I think we're working right now with like 50 companies on their HR handbooks. So all their policies, and even the policies around what is your drug and alcohol policy in the workplace. And even like putting a policy in a handbook is so scary for employers, because they're so afraid to put a wrong word in, or if I put this in, then I'm also going to have to then hold my people accountable to it. And then if there is a situation, how am I going to deal with the situation? And so maybe we'll just leave the policy out. Well, that doesn't solve the problem either. So it is having these difficult conversations to say we have to get real. And so what are the situations that happen that we all know happen on a daily basis? And what's going to be our policy? What's going to be if somebody, it could be a theft, it could be anything, if somebody breaks the policy, then what's the ramifications? And if it's something that we can provide resources to help somebody, why would we not do that? And so just again, that is why we wanted to open up this conversation. And so we're going to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. But would you, Ingrid, I'll ask you to start. What would be then an ideal, for somebody to contact you? What is an ideal like such client or situation, and an initial conversation?
It's anyone. I mean, really, that's the thing, Dina. Having spent all these years in healthcare, we would always talk about which industry was going to be able to use, the 2005, we gave everyone a Fitbit and made you walk 10,000 steps. I mean, that was 20 years ago, right? And having built those programs for so many years now, I've never seen something that is, again, so pervasive, so industry agnostic, and so age agnostic, right? So the conversations that we love to have are really just, hey, you want to learn about this? Do you want to see that there's another opportunity? Do you want to hear about how we can do it? Are you someone who is sober, who's interested in bringing us into your company? And we get, outreach directly from HR leaders, right? I mean, CHROs reach out to us and say, hey, you're working with one of my friends who lives in this town that I'm in. We heard what you're doing. We would love to chat with you. So right now it's interesting because we're talking to people who have 50,000 employees and people who have 50 employees. And, at this point, our goal is just to help as many humans as we possibly can, right? This is about how quickly can we get services available to people, because there's literally nothing right now. Literally nothing right now. There's no place to direct people towards. So that's our sit right now. But yeah, reach out to us, reach out to Maren at 𝗬𝗺, Ingrid at 𝗬𝗺. We are easy to get to and find. And we just very much appreciate you letting us have this conversation and leading this conversation, Dina. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being a part of it. And it will be interesting to see if you can get the 50 employee company moving faster than the 50,000 employee. It will be really interesting. Again, it's just going to be dependent on how fast that the key stakeholders at the top want to move, and where they're vested. Yeah.
So many fun case studies, right? So many fun case studies coming out of this. Here's what works best. Here's what doesn't work. Here's what you should do. Here's what you shouldn't do. Yeah, it's fascinating to see different speeds and different acceptabilities. And it's just really interesting, but making progress is the goal, right? So
yeah. Maren, anything else that you'd like to share before
No,
we wrap?
just the need is very high, as we talked about with all those numbers. So anywhere that you have access to any company where you say this should exist, which our opinion would be everywhere, but where you feel like this was a safe safe-ish environment where something like this could go, we would welcome the opportunity. And I think there's safety in numbers. You know, I think as more HR leaders see others prioritize this and talk about it, to the point of why aren't we talking about it? And Dina, you talked a little bit about where some of those blockers are. And a lot of the blockers are just lack of information. There has not been great training for HR leaders on this topic. The data shows that. So, you know, it's okay to come to the conversation and be like, I had no idea. I had no idea. And I thought that it would show up in my claims and we could talk through all the reasons why it doesn't, but that it's there and give you that ROI like you talked about, Dina, because it, you know, I'll say when we started SoberForce at Salesforce, it was, there was a little bit of fear from the legal team. Are people going to be saying things that are going to create harm? And I'm like, listen, employees are talking regardless. The behavior is happening regardless. This actually protects you. And then having Sobrinth on top actually protects you, because now you're giving employees a chance to get help before it's a crisis, before they leave that happy hour and get a DUI, you know, which I just heard that story this morning from someone who I met who said, oh gosh, I have this great colleague and just horrible situation. And it was at a work happy hour where she probably wouldn't have been drinking without it. So anyways, welcome all the conversations, what Ingrid said. So thank you so much for making space for this. This is honestly how we change the world, is through these conversations and making it okay and making it safe and saying, yeah, me too, my family too. And I just, yeah, I think it is that simple. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm super excited that you both have just leaned in and you're creating this and the mission to just go out and impact people and help them navigate. It is so important. So thank you for joining. And so I'll also share, so you're helping us kick off this Beyond the Policy, the human side of HR. So in October, on October 8th, I'm having my good friend 𝘄𝗹𝗵, who is the CEO of the Child Loss Foundation. So she's going to be speaking on how HR and people leaders can help employees who go through the loss of a child and how to come back to a workplace. So just again, you know, just powerful conversations on how leaders in HR can show up to be there for the whole self of these people, that because we all have lives and stuff going on. So also just welcome other conversations, and we just want to kind of break the cycle and have these conversations because they're super important to not just be checking the box on what policies do we have or don't have and bury our head in the sand, but how do we realize we have real humans that we're trying to lead. So thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. And until next time, and we'll make sure that in with the recap, we know how people can get in touch with both of you. Thank you.